Hi guys, welcome to Novum. The complete guide to the witch is well underway. The script is at the 70,000 word mark, and I am currently surrounded by piles upon piles of books about witchcraft, witch-related literature. But I thought, seeing as you wonderful people have pushed the Hereditary video all the way to 1 million views, we should have a little bonus video to celebrate. And on that note, ever since I posted that video, one particular question has been coming up that I never really anticipated. What happened next? And so today, hopefully, we're going to try and bring some closure to that. And my initial response to this question was nothing happens next. I don't want to see a sequel to a film I consider perfect. The art is what the art is. And if hell ever froze over and we did get a sequel, I'm certain whatever Ari Aster's, quite frankly, dangerous mind came up with, it likely wouldn't be what we were expecting. But despite still feeling that way towards a sequel, the speculating as to what comes next is something I've since come around on. Because the more I ruminated on it, the more I read other people's speculation about it, the more I thought, well, actually we can probably draw some conclusions as to what happened, and before I knew it, I had this video scripted out. So without trying to plan Hereditary 2, within the universe of Hereditary, once the credits have rolled, what do I think happened next? And we're really asking two questions there. The first being what becomes of Paimon and the cult on Earth, and the other one being what happens to the Graham family. Place your bets now on which answer is going to be more depressing. In both instances, the first thing we have to do is look at what direct evidence we have in the film for what might be coming. Let's start with Paimon on Earth, and I think the big piece of evidence, even though it's very small in the film, the really big indicator that Paimon has plans beyond the cult is this door. Now, some of you already know what I'm talking about. To everyone else, that was probably a little bit underwhelming. So let me elaborate. This door, a door flanked by a camera the cult are observing Annie through, is opposite the door of Joan's apartment. As Annie leaves, we see the number of the door says 202, which would make Joan's apartment 201. Joan being the de facto leader of the cult following the death of Annie's mother. Now, Paimon is a pretty big deal down in hell. He's one of its kings, in fact, and he isn't just into allergy tests and ghost riding the whip. Being a king, he's also a commander of hell's legions, usually 200 legions, but sometimes differing numbers. Just like every other aspect of hell's mythology, we see differing interpretations of Paimon. But the one that's really stuck around and that's lent on heavily in the film is the Lesser Key of Solomon. It's an enormously influential text, not just for Paimon, but hell's hierarchy and full supporting cast too. And it states directly that Paimon hath under his control 200 legions of spirits. So despite only being a very small detail in the film, this is a pretty clear suggestion. If Joan's apartment is 201 and she's the cult's leader, or priestess, let's say, then that would make the cult Paimon's 201st legion. And this time it's not a legion of spirits, it's a legion on Earth, a legion of flesh and blood cultists. It would seem like Paimon has a plan. Certainly intent, but we know Paimon has the gift of foresight. We know he's such a good planner, he can show you where to place a deer in the road to create the most iconic decapitation of all time. And naturally, one doesn't acquire a legion to just not use it, and this isn't his 207th legion. It's not a plan that's already underway. So something's coming, and this is the beginning of it. There is a plan beyond what we see in the film. But whether or not the cult are aware of what it entails is another thing entirely. We know the cult have a relatively simple plan from various hints in the film. Paimon promises the cult all the things that worship of Paimon in general promises. Riches, knowledge, success, foresight being the main ones. We see the cultist sat on a pile of gold. We see Ellen surrounded by falling gold coins upon marrying Paimon. We see the cult demonstrate knowledge of the future. We see the cult seemingly infiltrating the town successfully, and they have the knowledge to instill the souls of demonic entities in human bodies. So we know what their plan is and what they're getting out of it. But does that seem like Paimon is getting much out of it? I mean, sure, he's got a gorgeous new family and a ride or die bad bitch for a queen, but does Paimon strike you as a family man? In a film about hereditary familial struggles where he represents the main opposition. Paimon is known to be a figure that can esoterically assist you with all manner of problems, but one presumes that a demon, in this case a king of hell, is only going to help you if there's something in it for them. So sure, the cult are seeing benefits from Paimon, but we also have to presume Paimon is planning on seeing benefits from them beyond 3 heads and a kick-ass new demon bride. And that brings me to our next piece of evidence. The film is going out of its way to paint Paimon as a trickster god. Now obviously demons aren't to be trusted. There's a reason we have the idea of a Faustian bargain. They're always going to take more than they give, often in a way that is karmically unexpected. But generally in demonology, even modern worship of the occult, there isn't any emphasis on Paimon being an entity that will go out of his way to trick you. I've actually read accounts where he's tried to go beyond his means to help people, but in Hereditary this really isn't the case. He is a literal trickster god. Now, in a meta sense, this helps us rationalize moments like the original Charlie speaking to the family from hell, or Annie thinking she's going to burn herself with the book but instead burning Steve, and maybe even this fake grandson writing on a chalkboard, although that could potentially be Lucifer himself there, given the fake grandson is called Louis. But Paimon's status as a trickster god here should also hold worrying significance for the cult. They are the ones who have signed a bargain with him, who have sworn to follow him. If anyone is going to be truly tricked by the trickster god, it's likely to be them. And so that's the first definite conclusion we can make. The cult are, quite literally, going to get more than they bargained for. Paimon does have a plan, and the cult presume they're on the right side of it, but they're almost certainly unaware of its full scope. And while they will enjoy riches and success and so on, things are almost certainly going to go badly for them beyond that. At the very least, it's likely that serving directly under a king of hell is going to be worse than they expected. Bridget is almost certainly a cult member, and look at how she reacts to Paimon smashing Peter's face into the desk. Look at how little regard Paimon seems to have for the human body. Even if it's something as simple as them not being on board for quite how fucked up things are going to get, that's still going to be pretty bad. But I think we can say that an angry Paimon being violent to those that follow him is a definite possibility. And perhaps more likely than that this is a Faustian bargain and it could well mean a horrific end for the cult. Damnation, perhaps turning into lesser demons, perhaps just very grisly stuff on Earth. Whatever happens, on a long enough timeline, chances are it's not going to be roses for the cult. But beyond the cult, what about Paimon himself? To quickly explain what we have at the end here, Paimon is in Peter's body, the male host that he required to exist more comfortably in human skin, something that allows him to achieve a more powerful form than he may otherwise have had. As the film puts it, a successful incarnation. And that tracks with what we see. Paimon in Charlie's body is confused and sad and potentially even unconsciously looking for ways to extricate his soul from Charlie's body. Even though we see him quite confused at the end, we can presume that's because he's just been inserted into a different body, and that's probably a jarring process. But once that's done with, we can assume that he's going to be more alert, more verbal, more aware of himself and what he's on Earth to do. The situation with Paimon's soul is complicated. He seems to only instill a fractured piece of himself in Charlie while still operating independently from that piece in the wider spirit world. That's why we can see him spiritually guiding Charlie while also occupying her body. We can't say if that will change now he's successfully incarnated in Peter, but there does seem to be a very subtle suggestion in the performance that Paimon has become alert to what's happening in a way that he wasn't inside Charlie. It could simply be due to terror, but the last thing we hear in the script is that Peter's eyes are buzzing. And to me, that doesn't just suggest staring in terror. It suggests a kind of freshly kindled energy. And we can also see his mannerisms becoming more bird-like, but I've already covered the bird stuff in another video. And keep in mind that Ari Aster described this film as the sacrifice from the lamb's perspective. So that's all we're seeing here in this movie, the catalyst, the moment of Paimon's summoning. We can presume the Paimon that comes after that is a much scarier thing to deal with that's far more aware of his own motivations. So what can we say for sure? Well, that Paimon is awake to his mission. He has a cult that's subservient to him, his 201st Legion on Earth. They've had promises made to them that he will almost certainly keep, but what comes along with that is likely more horrible than we or they can imagine. As for what he does next, we know he's a manipulator, a schemer. Paimon in general uses his cunning more than anything. He's not a demon that traditionally goes with fear first, being preceded as he is by instruments and court members and finery. In my mind, he's going to be more of a master of whispers and manipulation than a battlefield general. He's clearly not afraid of brute force, but his physicality as we see it in the film is largely secondary to his manipulations producing the desired outcome. It seems very likely that while inhabiting Annie, he could have just killed Peter if he wanted to, but obviously he chose not to because he has a plan. He can promise wealth, and his followers are part of a cult, and so it's somewhat of a no-brainer to presume their ranks would continue to grow. And from there, it's really up to you, but we know the Miltonian framework the film is running on. From that, we know what its hierarchy desires, which is to rule, thinking it better to be kings in hell rather than servants in heaven. And we know they would like to rule heaven, and would like to interfere with Earth at the very least. So it does seem likely that ruling, or at the very least having a great deal of influence on Earth, would be the primary goal. We can't say for certain how complete the cult's control is over the local area, but we have every suggestion that many of the characters we see, in some scenes all of the characters we see, are likely to be cultists. That to me already demonstrates a preferred method of draw people to your cause in secret while potentially infiltrating positions of authority through them. And so that would be my speculation, that Paimon, buoyed along by an ever-growing cult of the willing, uses his abilities to influence and involve himself in earthly power structures, likely as part of the wider machinations of Hell's designs on Earth. I think President Paimon is probably too far-fetched, but positions under that, military, defense, religious institutions perhaps, the list is pretty long, but ultimately he and the cult would be wherever they needed to be to ensure the right outcome for whatever pandemonium has in store for us. That could be a finger on the big red button. It could also be an editorial position at Fox News. Now, before we move on to the Grahams, I'm sure some of you are asking, what about a happier ending? What about the police showing up and arresting the cult? What about humans finding a way to put a stop to Paimon? And all I can say to that is maybe, but we can only go off what we have in the film, and unfortunately that is the cult acting essentially unopposed. The most resistance we see from the family, the only real resistance we see against the cult, is Peter noping out of a window in sheer terror and not just failing to get away, but ultimately playing right into the hands of the cult. This isn't a horror movie where we see our protagonists struggle against evil. They are crushed by it before they ever know what's happening. It's impossible to extrapolate any positives from that, any weaknesses the cult might have. Unfortunately, the cults seem to be pretty good at what they do, and they're about to become a lot more powerful. And so now we come to the other side of what happened next. What happens to the Grahams? They are, of course, all dead. Even Peter, who, just like original Charlie, has had his soul fully displaced from his body. But thanks to OG Charlie and her appearance during the seance, we have very good evidence that the Grahams are still going to exist in an afterlife. Almost certainly hell, given it's the only afterlife mentioned in the film, and it's where Paimon resides. We can be more specific and say they'll likely be in Pandemonium, the high capital city of Satan and his Stygian council, as it's put. And we know this because we see its name written on the wall, along with possible other small references to John Milton's Paradise Lost, in which we see the city of Pandemonium being first incepted. In fact, when we see that word written on the wall, it's preceded by the word liftoch, meaning open, which would suggest there is maybe this intent for the gates of hell to open and its forces to spill forth onto Earth. So we could definitely say where they're going, which is this place, not quite 5-star, but they have great central heating. The question then becomes, okay, well, what does life in hell look like for the Grahams? Now, in my guide video, I kind of hinted at their fate with a couple of jokes. The first being that the family dog Max won't be in hell with them because all dogs go to heaven, and that one is true and isn't up for discussion. But the other was that the Grahams would spend the rest of eternity serving as Paimon's sexual furniture, and that one was more of a facetious invoking of the Hellraiser or Slanesh aesthetic, rather than a legitimate assessment. That doesn't mean I think everything is just wonderful for them down there, but if we're trying to draw conclusions here, we have to consider all the options. And as odd as it may sound to someone who hasn't seen the movie, we actually have a pretty clear suggestion that hell might not be all that bad for the Grahams. That primarily comes in the form of this note to Annie from her mother Ellen. In it, we see Ellen expressing her shame that she hasn't been there as a mother for Annie. But let's focus in on the second half here. Try not to despair your losses. You will see in the end that they were worth it. Our sacrifice will pale next to the rewards. So pretty obviously that translates to, don't freak out that I've arranged for us all to be murdered because I've made the right decision and we're going to be richly rewarded by Paimon. And she's making the claim that Annie's losses, the deaths of everyone she loves, will pale next to what they receive in return. So Ellen must be imagining something pretty lavish, pretty amazing, if she's confident that Annie will eventually see these horrendous losses and an eternity in hell as something to be smiling about. And in Ellen's defense, she could well be right. She could have seen it indirectly via Paimon. There is no one we're presented with that seems to have more knowledge, more motivation here than Ellen. She's certain enough to become Paimon's bride, certain enough to arrange for the deaths of her family, certain enough to commit her life and afterlife to it. It's also worth mentioning that this note is very much one of yearning for a positive relationship on Ellen's part, an admission she wasn't the best mother, and this notion that they're together in their sacrifice and things will improve in the future. So it's safe to say Ellen's under the impression that wherever they're going there together. And she just got hitched to a king of hell, so we don't really have to guess where that might be. So as sucky as it is, we know Charlie's already in hell, we know Ellen just married into hell's hierarchy, and she's seemingly suggesting they'll all be happily reunited there when this is over. For these losses to be worth it to Annie, you'd presume that would mean she's going to be reunited with all of them. So I think that's a safe bet that every one of the Grahams is in hell, except Max. Now we have two potential realities from there for the Grahams. One is that the deal is above board and Ellen has not been misled. She really does serve as a queen in hell. She's correct about what she says in the note, and the sacrifices really do pale in comparison to the rewards. And given that hell is a relatively shit place for anyone living there, I think for the rewards to truly be rewards, then in this instance we could assume that the Grahams really are some level of royalty, that they are treated with extreme respect, as if they are extensions of Paimon himself. Now, just for me personally, I don't think having servants would make me cool with the whole rivers of magma and demonic sodomy on every street corner thing. And it's difficult to imagine any modern family, but let's say Steve, for example, being cool with that either. Annie I can kind of see as eventually coming to terms with being royalty in hell, mostly just because Toni Collette is so good at being Arch. The other option, of course, is that Paimon is lying and the Grahams are going to spend an eternity having a very bad time. It's not just the cult that made a Faustian bargain, Ellen did too. And other than Ellen's promise, all of the other evidence we see seems to suggest this. Not just Paimon's obvious disregard for humanity, but also original Charlie's fearful and confused state in hell. The fact that Paimon is willing to use her eternal soul simply to scare the family. Charlie's been there, or wherever she is, for over a decade, and she doesn't seem particularly chill with it. If those years have been spent lounging on her chaise longue, being fed grapes and getting gently fanned, then I doubt she'd have seemed so frantic. And when you couple that with the horrendous torment the family are being subjected to just to make this plan work, and the general twisted behaviour we see Paimon exhibiting, it really doesn't paint a picture of hell the Grahams will be happy living in. Perhaps not Ellen either once she comes to terms with it. Although there is one more potential positive I've missed out because it's quite subjective, and that's the apparition we see of Ellen. Now don't get me wrong, this is fucking creepy. But she's not trying to scare Annie, even if she scares us. We can argue, and I have argued, that her appearance here is designed to kickstart Annie's interest in the supernatural, to make her a believer in the supernatural and have her do the things she needs to do to fully let Paimon in, and to make her a vulnerable host, as we see mentioned in this book, so that she can be controlled or possessed and used as Paimon's tool. We see other references to this in the same book, suggesting Paimon feeds on fear and needs to somehow psychically weaken his targets prior to possessing them. And on a functional meta level and in regard to Paimonic law, that is what's happening. But there's something else too. When you get past how creepy this is, you notice that Ellen actually has quite a warm smile on her face. And keep in mind, Annie's just read this potentially reassuring note. Again, very creepy when you don't know what we're talking about, but we're discussing this post all of the Grahams dying. So we're looking at it via a very different lens. And you can read it as being quite reassuring, especially when you combine it with the smile from Ellen. So on top of everything I mentioned this scene is doing, I think this is also Ellen's attempt at reassuring Annie, of letting her know what she's saying in the note is accurate. She's proving the existence of an afterlife to her and letting her know the pain that's coming is temporary. And when we'll see Ellen in the field, again, it's very creepy, super not cool when you see it the first time, but she's not doing anything horrible. She's dressed all in white, sat by a fire, representing that she's now this queen of hell, but she's relatively peaceful. Again, she seems to be there to reassure Char Paimon that all of this is going to be okay. So while hell is probably a very nasty place where the human body is very far from sacrosanct, for now at least, Ellen seems to be taking to it better than original Charlie has been. So what happens next, that's really up to your headcanon. Since making this video, I actually think there's more concrete evidence that hell will be as Ellen promised rather than as we might expect it. She certainly seems calm and she's only really just got there. That being said, this is hell we're talking about. Presumably we're just supposed to know it's bad. And for me, I find it very difficult to get past this decision to change Paimon's law to make him this outright trickster god. To me, that suggests at the very least the cult are on the wrong end of a Faustian bargain, potentially Ellen too. If you make a deal with the trickster god, you should expect to get tricked. But I have to say, the evidence seems to point more towards Ellen being okay with the experience thus far. I just find it very difficult to imagine any of our characters except Ellen being able to happily resign themselves to a life in pandemonium. And who knows, maybe once Paimon has everything he wants, Ellen may not be happy with the treatment either. Again, this film focuses on the damage we incur from those who come before us, from our families. It would make sense that karmic retribution for Ellen, the thing people go to hell for, would be choosing to marry into a new family where she is met with the same cold uncaring that she showed to her own family. And my guess is Paimon is capable of being a lot worse than she was. So hopefully that answers some questions you might not have known you had. Remember, it's just a fun little thought experiment, so don't take it too seriously. And please comment below with your theories on what might have happened, because I'd love to read them. The weirder the better. I just want to say thank you so much for getting my Hereditary guide to 1 million views. It's really not something I ever expected to happen, or even really thought was possible. So thank you. If you haven't seen it and you enjoyed these details, you can go find lots more on the main video. There's even a remastered and uncensored version on my Patreon now if you want all the grisly bits and curse words too. You can also check out me reacting to the Cinema Sins video for Hereditary and Midsummer as well on there. I add up my own sin score as we go, and unsurprisingly, my score is very different to theirs. Thank you to everyone that is supporting me there. It's already making a tangible difference to how frequently I can get the complete guide videos out, and it provides a security that YouTube simply can't. Alright, I think that's everything. I have to go get back to my piles of witch research, so hopefully at some point my fiance can get the living room back. I'm really not being hyperbolic when I say piles. I'm using books as bookmarks for other books. It's bad. I'm not quite ready to announce a release date yet, but it's coming together quickly in comparison to Midsummer, and I'd love to have it ready for Halloween. Speak soon, guys. Stay safe and enjoy your summer. Hail Paimon.